thank you everyone for having me here. It's exciting to be back. I haven't actually been to Newcastle before. It's exciting to be back in the UK. I thought I would start with a bit of an exercise. Let's see, is Jenny still here by chance? Yeah. Okay, so you're our one Irish person here. I've decided to call my talk Descriptions of and Prescriptions for Green Criminology. So I'm going to use the four-leaf clover as an analogy. As an Irish woman, can you tell us what the four cloves stand for?
Religious?
Well, that's what the three are for. It's the Trinity. Four.
Sorry, I can't tell you.
Okay, well maybe it's because you've been in Wales for a while. They actually stand for faith, hope, love, and luck. I didn't know this until about a month ago. And these are going to be principles that I'll get back to in the end. But today I wanted to suggest that green criminology has, to some extent, functioned like a four-leaf clover, or at least the way I'm going to depict it today. But it's been a somewhat disjointed or sort of morphed four-leaf clover. So whereas the one that you see on the PowerPoint slide suggests that all leaves are somewhat equal, I think what green criminology has done is created a kind of engorged one in some spaces. And so the way I've drawn it is a bit like this. So each of these leaves or cloves of the clover represent certain areas of green criminology. But what I want to suggest is that the area called issues in green criminology has been the one that's been given or been granted the most space. So my talk today is about these four different cloves or leaves. What Nigel has done has given us some of the roots of this four-leaf clover and then touched on certain areas here. I'll retrace a couple of the roots, but leave his foundation intact, and then hopefully come back through some of these different areas. So forgive my crude drawing, though I do have 2 degrees in art. Drawing four-leaf clovers is not one of them. So to begin, issues in green criminology. Since the early 90s, when first proposed by Lynch, green criminology has been concerned with environmental crimes and harms affecting non-human life. As Nigel mentioned before, and as numerous green criminologists have said in previous instances, green criminologists have mostly devoted their time to illuminating and describing different types of environmental harm. And so this has included works in animal rights and animal abuse, such as that by Pierce Byrne, Angus's work, harm caused by hazardous transport of e-waste, so there's some research more generally, more recently in that regard, harm caused by global warming and climate change, Matthew Paul's work, some of the work by Lynch and Strukowski, pollution crimes, food crimes such as that by Reese Walters, and then issues such as illegal deforestation, illegal straitened species, the work by Melanie Wellsmith, Jenny's work, Tanya's work, work that has been mentioned earlier today. What I want to suggest is that we've had sort of various typologies with which to think about these different crimes. Some of them are similar to what Nigel has mentioned. I try to think of them, or at least I'm going to try to set them out by the most basic or rudimentary typology to one that I think is a little bit more complex. So it's very basic level. One can simply take the work in green criminology and divide it into work that falls into a legal procedural approach and work that falls into a socio-legal approach. The legal procedural approach is basically research on environmental issues that focus on violations of existing environmental law, which includes civil and regulatory violations, designed to protect the health, safety, and vitality of humans, natural resources, and ecosystems. A socio-legal approach simply looks at environmental harms that may not be statutorily prescribed. So you can simply say, let's take all of the issues that have been addressed in green criminology and put them in either of these two camps. That would be the most rudimentary way of typologizing green criminology. One could then look at what I call scale of causation. causation can really refer to two different things. Who's committing the crime and harm, and why that person or entity is committing that crime or harm. By scale of causation, I mean the first of these two connotations. So at the very most, I guess, smallest level would be the individual. So this is work such as that by Bob Agnew, his ordinary acts that contribute to ecocide that Nigel mentioned include things such as an individual decision to live in a large suburban house, especially one that's heated or cooled to comfortable levels. When I checked into the Holiday Inn, which Tanya was nice enough to put me up in, I was struck by the fact that, first of all, it's very dark in the room, and second of all, that I couldn't actually turn on the lights until I put my little key card into the side of the wall. And even then, the lights took a long time to illuminate because they were environmentally friendly light bulbs. This was the exact opposite of what you would have in the States, where you would go into a hotel room and every single light would be turned on. It wouldn't be unsurprising if the water was left on for you. The heat would be lasting if it were sometime in the winter. It would be air conditioned beyond belief sometime in the summer. And just about every possible electronic device that could be working would be either on or ready to be worked. And so I think Agnew would consider that to be an everyday act of ecocide. Using a fuel-inefficient, gasoline-powered automobile, another example of his, frequently purchasing consumer products, regularly consuming meat, all these fall under his notion of ordinary acts that contribute to ecocide. And so I see these as very much individual acts. Granted, they can be done by many people across populations, but it's a sort of one-to-one relationship with that kind of environmental harm. I think Nick's work on litter would also fall into that category as well. Certainly you have groups of people who litter, but as he mentions at the beginning of his chapter for our handbook, we see people on a daily basis dropping things as they walk to and from buildings during the course of their routine activities, to poach that phrase. From the individual level, we can move to the micro level. By this, I consider sort of group level harms, or harms that are specific to certain groups. This came up a little bit in our discussion after Nigel's talk, Matthew's comments regarding the Inuits, or Angus's comments regarding bushmeat. We can think of sort of artisanal or subsistence or traditional fisheries that often exploit fishery resources and degrade the ecosystems on which they depend. So small groups contributing to ecocide or contributing to some sort of environmental harm as a result of some group type of element. Alaskan natives who are exempt from the U.S.'s Marine Mammal Protection Act allows them to engage in subsistence hunting of a certain species of whale, so that would also fall into that kind of grouping as well. And then my third level of the scale of causation is what I would call macro or macrostructural. So these are environmental crimes that are facilitated by the state, as well as corporations and other powerful actors, insofar as these institutions have the capacity to shape official definitions of environmental crime, or in ways that allow or condone environmentally harmful practices. And so the research that's been conducted here falls into these overlapping categories of organized crime, corporate or white-collar crime, state-level crime, crimes in the corporate state, state-corporate crime, state-corporate environmental crime, transnational crime, and the names and contributors here are significant. Ray Michalowski's work comes to mind, that of Ron Kramer as well, Carol Gibbs's work, some of the work that Nigel has done with Vincenzo. All of those could sort of fall into that macro or macro-structural type of category. So from my second, the scale of causation, we can move to the primary green crimes and secondary green crimes, which Nigel mentioned during his talk. I won't rehash too much of that now, but the idea is that you can divide them into these two categories of primary crimes that come about directly from the destruction and degradation of Earth's resources, and then these secondary ones that are sort of symbiotic with or dependent upon such destructions and efforts to regulate or prevent it. So I consider that to be sort of less complex a typology because the primary category has those sort of four prongs that Nigel set forth before. crimes against animals, crimes of water pollution. Turning to my fourth typology, color. This is the brown, green, and white categories that Rob White has spoken a little bit about. So brown issues, just to rehash what Nigel said, tend to be defined in terms of urban life and pollution. Air pollution may deals with water pollution, urban stormwater pollution. Green issues dealing with wilderness areas and conservation matters, also including acid rain, loss of wildlife, toxic algae, habitat destruction. And then white issues, which refer to science laboratories, the impact of new technologies, the GMOs, food irradiation, pathological indoor environments. I think one could make an argument for some gray issues, which I didn't put in there. But a graduate student of mine and I are working on issues of gray water recycling, issues of sort of taking your bath water or your dishwater and trying to use it for watering your plants, and how in some parts of the States, and I'm not sure if this is the case in the UK, but in some parts of the States, that's been criminalized or heavily regulated to the point where one can't do it because it involves taking water away from septic systems and sewer systems. So maybe there's room for gray in there. I will note, though, that this brown, green, and white typology that Rob White has mentioned touches on, but I think really misses a larger issue of race and ethnicity, because racial and ethnic groups often have different environmental concerns, reflecting different eco-philosophies and different experiences of environmental harm. That typology probably could be fleshed out a bit more. But it does remain a way with which we can categorize these issues in environmental crime or issues in criminology. My fourth category of issues is geographic. Rob White conceptualizes geographies of harm, which include the local, the national, the regional, the global, and the transnational. More recently, he's focused on transnational environmental crime. I prefer a slightly different way of thinking about this. I prefer the local, the regional as intranational, the regional as international or transnational, national or state level, and global. And I'll explain what I mean by this. I think it involves or entails two types of questions. One is, where is the harm caused? The other is, where is the harm experienced, felt, or manifested? So let's see how this will work out. So a local geographic issue. One might ask, is the harm peculiar to a specific geographical context, and only that specific geographical context? Is it an environmental harm that only occurs in one particular place? Another type of local question could be, is the harm peculiar to a specific geographical context that exists in various places around the world? So desertification or drought in northern Africa, parts of Australia. You can sort of think of it as putting little tacks or pins on parts of a map or globe. Those to me would be sort of local issues. Regional in the intranational sense. You could ask, is the harm regional in the sense of being international, as in a problem where the cause and origin of the harm and the locus of where it's experienced is within the same nation state. So, for instance, if you're familiar with the geography of the United States, there's a river in the southeast called the Chattahoochee River, and it forms the southern half of Alabama and Georgia and part of the Florida border. That, to me, would be a regional issue of international dimensions, because it's within the United States in a certain geographical region within it. Is the harm regional in the sense of being international or transnational? That's a question of, this is a problem that crosses nation-state borders, where the cause or origin of the harm and the locus of where it's experienced are in different states. So, for example, the nuclear accident in Chernobyl, the fallout from that was felt in Belarus, Russia, Sweden, Italy, Moldova, so on and so forth. Pollution of the Danube River, for example, passes through or touches on areas such as Romania, Hungary, Germany, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia, and so on and so forth. So that, to me, would be regional in the transnational or international dimension. National or nation-state level harm. This is harm that affects all of the nation-state, but which does not cause harm outside of that nation-state. Or if it's causing harm outside of that nation-state, it's a very sort of limited locus. So for example, overuse of land for agriculture and pastoral purposes in New Zealand would sort of fall under that kind of category. Though I would note that national problems affecting an entire nation-state, can be experienced in multiple nation-states, much like the local problem that I defined earlier. And then there are issues of global dimension. And by this I mean something that is felt and caused by multiple places all around the world. Climate change is probably the best example of that. Acid rain might fall under that category as well. So what I'm suggesting with this first large engorged clover or leaf is that a lot of green criminology has been very issue specific. It's been about exposing, illuminating a particular type of harm, trying to call attention to it, at times trying to think a little bit about issues of causation, sort of who's causing it, but that's been sort of the meat and potatoes, or the bulk of the work that we've seen. I don't mean that at all as a criticism. I think it's been very, very important for the genesis and continuation of green criminology. I'm just simply saying that we've put a lot more effort into that. And sometimes that's what's necessary to get an aspect of a discipline moving. But what I want to suggest, and this is where I sort of turn from what we've done to what we might want to think about doing, is that we contemplate issues of theoretical development. This brings us back to some of Rob White's comments about how green criminology doesn't have a theory as such. Nigel's comments in 1998 about how this is really a green perspective rather than a theory. And so what I want to suggest is that just as criminology is more than explaining the etiology of criminal behavior, green criminology is more than just explaining the etiology of environmentally harmful or criminal behavior. But up till now, we haven't done very much in this regard. And I think that this is unfortunate. Usually I take off my jacket at the point at the top where I'm going to say something a little bit combative. So now I've warned you. The people I'm going to take issue with are not here. So that always makes it easier to fight. So Carol Gibbs, whom I'm quite fond of, along with Edwin McGarrell and Mark Axelrod, wrote an article for Criminology and Public Policy a number of years ago called Transnational White-Collar Crime and Risk, Lessons from the Global Trade in Electronic Waste. And they state, and I would say rather anemically, that perceptual variations of lure and willingness to exploit opportunities are a consideration. Individuals and organizations, be they predisposed or tempted, have taken advantage of the criminal opportunities associated with e-waste, as evidenced by risky transactions and white-collar crime. Well, which is it? Are they predisposed? Are they tempted? Are they both? Are they neither? These are very sort of key questions about etiology. As someone who teaches perspectives in crime and delinquency, which is the sort of euphemism for criminological theory, if my students mix up predisposed to crime and tempted by crime, they don't do very well. So I think that this is an important distinction and something that we as green criminologists need to devote a little bit more time to thinking. Are some of the crimes and harms that we're seeing the result of predisposition? Are they a result of temptation? And I think that we're beginning to see some effort to bring in mainstream criminological thought, or mainstream criminological theory, into our explanation of green crime. Bob Agnew is a good example. His Ordinary Acts draws on existing social psychological theories of a crime to explain why individuals and small groups engage in this range of ordinary behaviors, or ordinary acts. His Dire Forecast, which is an article that came out in Theoretical Criminology recently, again tries to look at the impact of climate change on crime from this sort of mainstream criminological theory. As a strain theorist, his focus is going to be on strain theory, but I think we could bring into this any number of mainstream criminological theories. So take techniques of visualization. Can you define, or can you use that to consider some type of individual environmental act that's harmful? Do you deny responsibility? Do you deny that littering has a victim? Do you deny that there's an injury involved to dropping a piece of paper on the ground? Do you condemn the condemners? Do you appeal to higher loyalties? I think that these are questions that could be asked both at the individual level, the macro level, the micro level. We could bring in some of those theories. I'm tempted to suggest that this is also the work that Gary Potter thought about at Delft. I didn't have the pleasure of hearing your talk, but you did have something about mainstream green crime, so I was thinking maybe that's something about what we were talking about. A little bit, good. Good guess on my part. Mike Lynch's work, as Nigel said, is also trying to do some of this. In his article or his chapter for our handbook, he offers a very simple method for comparing the extent of environmental crime victimization to the NCBS, or National Crime Victimization Surveys. He does this with sort of pollution data, so he's trying to see if maybe we could look at environmental crime through the same type of victimization surveys that we do in the United States. He also reviews the Eco-City perspective that emerged in the 1970s, examines how that view creates a green criminological extension of social disorganization theories. There's an attempt to use social disorganization to describe environmental types of crimes, very different from what it was initially thought of from the Chicago School. So pretty much this suggests that any kind of mainstream theory could be used or could be applied to describe environmental crimes or environmental harms. So an attempt at what I consider to be intra-theoretical development. Use what we have, but apply it to understanding the causation, the sense of the etiology, the why environmental crimes are occurring. Efforts to forge linkages with other branches or subfields of criminology have not been limited to etiology. So we've also seen within green criminology efforts to look at the meanings and representations of crime. And I was trying to think about sort of how to tie this into the questions that were coming up after Nigel's talk. And the question that you raised about, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Jasper.
As Jasper raised about whether or not Nigel had switched from being a social scientist to more of an activist with somewhat of an agenda, led me to think a little bit about the late Clifford Geertz, the cultural anthropologist. As someone with an anthropologist degree, I was forced to study him and did so somewhat reluctantly. And it wasn't until after I decided that I wasn't really an anthropologist that I decided I liked his work. Geertz is well known for his idea that we should be looking at culture as sort of a series of symbols. And so his endeavor was to try to find not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. And I think that we've been toying with that a little bit within green criminology. Let me give a couple of examples. The first is what Combe and Greenhill have tried to do, or are starting to try to do, with what they call popular green criminology. I think that they describe it better than I could, so I'm going to read a little bit of an excerpt from their work. So they try to extend Rafter's concept of popular criminology to green criminology to better appreciate the philosophical, moral, and emotional dimensions of the relationship between crime and the social and physical environments, and undertaking they label popular green criminology. As they explain, if popular criminology is a discourse found in accessible mass-mediated texts exploring issues pertaining to crime and justice, popular green criminology, then, is a branch of popular criminology dealing with environmental harm issues, issues of space and place, and the oppression of human and non-human animals by people and institutions. So they look at the Red Riding trilogy, which I've not seen, but I know is a UK development. And they say that this represents, presents a popular green criminology of child sexual abuse, police and government corruption, class warfare, and environmental destruction by powerful corporate interests and private individuals. The trilogy interrogates the causes and consequences of harms to human and non-human animals and communities by linking individuals' actions to broader social, structural, and institutional processes in the imagined world of Yorkshire. They go on to suggest that if green criminology does intend to seek to foster an understanding of the interconnected nature of harm and the broader physical and social environment, a popular green criminology can be a powerful ally in that development. From here, there's the work that Nigel and I have started to try to push forward with this green cultural criminology. We try to take a number of different angles. At the very basic level, we try to demonstrate that cultural criminology, as promulgated by Jeff Farrell, Keith Hayward, Jock Young, Chris Greer, is at some level already doing green criminology with its investigations of contestation of urban space. We also suggest, though, that green criminologists might or could adopt a cultural criminological lens, and this would entail devoting greater attention to the mediated construction of environment and environmental harm. So I've written a little bit about the way that climate change is discussed in the mass media and how the mass media tends to give greater attention to people who are called climate change skeptics or contrarians in an effort to create balanced journalism. What that really does is create an imbalance because there's much more science promoting or suggesting that climate change is real than science in scare quotes that suggests that it's not occurring. Another avenue that I've tried to look at has been apocalyptic fiction and film, which sort of portrays what is going to happen to the environment, whether it's the day after tomorrow or something along those lines. It gives us this image of what we think will transpire, and that could, some might argue, be somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So maybe that feature of surrender that we talked about in the question and answer period. Another element of this green cultural criminology would entail devoting more energy to the ways in which environmental harms are resisted on the streets in the day-to-day. I think this is an interest of Gary Potter. Examples might include critical mass, reclaim the streets, guerrilla gardening, these sort of playful types of resistance, maybe less so from a movement perspective, but this sort of do-it-yourself type of resistance. And then our green cultural criminology also takes issues of consumption into play, but in a slightly different way than the sort of Marxist analysis that Mike Lynch advocates quite strongly. My third example from the sort of meaning and representation element is sport criminology and green criminology. And this is something that I've learned about since Nick created it. This idea of sport criminology. And so as soon as it came out, it got me thinking about the issue of horse racing in the United States and how veterinarians are put in this very difficult position of trying to determine whether or not horses are actually able to compete and being sort of induced to dope them so that they can compete at higher levels. And so that to me sort of presented an opportunity to create this inquiry about sport with this inquiry of animal abuse and animal rights. Bullfighting, I think, could also fall into this category as well. But this attempt to sort of look at the meaning of representation. And by this I mean attempts within criminology or within green criminology to look outside of criminology, to look at other disciplines. I realize that this is not a perfect setup because quite a lot of green criminologists and criminologists more generally come from other disciplines. I am not a criminologist by training. I am only a criminologist by love and by design. I others would say, well, it seems just natural to look at it outside of these disciplinary boundaries that we've set up. But some people are doing that sort of more actively than others. So the first example that comes to mind with respect to etiology is the work of Matthew Grief and Paul Strakowski, who have been trying to develop this idea of the treadmill of production, which comes from environmental economics or environmental studies, less so from green criminology. They're trying to bring it into green criminology. Here's how they're doing it. They're trying to expand green criminology by using this theory as a basis for the analysis of environmental laws. And so they apply that theory of ecological disorganization to a study of state laws that specifically regulate the discharge of oil into navigable waters. Treadmill of production theory is a little, well, it's a little less than intuitive. Let me see if I can encapsulate it. Treadmill of production theory stands in sharp contrast to ecological modernization. In short, the debate between treadmill of production and ecological modernization is one that's long-standing in environmental literature. So ecological modernization is based upon the idea that people will create laws that will reduce ecological disorganization, and society will develop technology that will eliminate this disorganization. Thus, while ecological modernization focuses on reductions in toxic releases, recycling, cradle-to-grave technology, treadmill production theory challenges that notion. Important to it is this idea that ecological disorganization is a function of the pressure to increase production, and that social movement organizations can change those production practices, and in some instances pressure the state to enact laws that regulate firms and the amount of natural resources they consume. So according to treadmill production theory, technology will not solve the problem of ecological disorganization. That's somewhat, I think, an issue of etiology. I think that that's where I would place the work of Grief and Strakowski in terms of this extra-disciplinary theoretical development. From a meaning and representation perspective, I think the work of Stephanie Kane, who by training and by practice is an anthropologist. She's done work in Brazil and in Argentina. She offers a way in which green criminology might foster an understanding of the interconnected nature of harm in a broader physical and social environment. So, for example, she explores the coastline of Brazil and the ways in which environmental codes are sidestepped in the tourist industry, where a commodified landscape consumes habitat and dissipates co-evolved networks of plants and animals. Up to my fourth and final clover here. Environmental relationships. And so I've put only two here. I think we could add to this list, and that's part of what I hope you can help me do. But let me discuss two. Environmental rights as they relate to other rights regimes or as they might be considered to be other types of rights, and environment and conflict. Let me do the rights part first, and then end with the conflict, because that seems to be an issue that was percolating a bit in the previous session. So the term environmental rights can refer to substantive rights, such as the right to live in a healthy environment, which entails access to unspoiled natural resources, air, land, water, that are all necessary to survive. Environmental rights can refer to procedural rights, allowing for access to environmental information, public participation in decision-making, and access to remedial procedures, so redress to judicial authorities. Or environmental rights can refer to ecological rights, rights for the environment based on notions of nature's intrinsic value rather than its utility to humans. Substantive environmental rights and procedural environmental rights both reflect an anthropocentric or human-centered perspective, one that views non-human nature instrumentally as something to be appropriated, processed, consumed, and disposed of in a manner which best suits the immediate interests of human beings. The notion of environmental rights as ecological rights reflects a biocentric perspective, one that holds that non-human species have intrinsic value, that is, they possess a moral worth and will continue to have moral worth no Whether environmental rights includes one or all of those definitions, or some concept other than those, depends on how the notion of rights more generally is understood. Rights are ethical, legal, moral, or social principles of freedom or entitlement. Their interests or expectations guaranteed by an ethical, moral, or philosophical theory, a legal system, or social convention. Any discussion of rights, or any discussion of environmental rights, must begin with a consideration of the sources of those rights. So we could look at substantive environmental rights as natural rights, or as legal rights. We could consider procedural environmental rights as legal rights. We could consider ecological rights as implicating issues regarding legal rights. So, for example, the citation to Stone that Nigel mentioned during his slides comes from an article from 1972 called Trees Have Standing. In the United States, you have to have standing in order to bring a case in a court of law. So a tree can't obviously make the case, but a human could make the case for the tree, but what we often have to show is that there was some negative impact to humans, not just a negative impact to the tree. Some suggest that you should be able to make the claim for the tree without any impact on a human. So there's got to be an instance of ecological rights implicating issues regarding legal rights. And then we have to consider sort of relationships between different sectors of rights. So are environmental rights distinct from human rights, or are they subsumed under conceptions of human rights? What happens when there are conflicts between environmental rights and property rights? This is a particularly salient issue in parts of the western United States, where you have people who demand their property rights to certain aspects of land, and that often comes into conflict with statutes, both state and federal, dictating some component of environmental degradation, deprivation, protection, or conservation. And then we have issues about conflicts between environmental rights and cultural or indigenous rights. So this can come up in the context of bushmeat, it can come up in the context of sort of subsistence whaling, or culturally whaling, practices that are peculiar to a particular culture or a particular cultural practice or a particular indigenous community, but do have negative environmental impact. So how do we weigh the relationship between those two? So what I would suggest is that how environmental rights should be understood and or realized with respect to human rights may be subject to further debate, but the fundamental point is that environmental degradation and environmental protection are intertwined with both human rights and environmental rights. I think that this is likely to receive more prominent recognition in the future as, for example, human rights obligations, both those that are substantive and those that are procedural, are likely to be relevant to the design and implementation of effective responses to climate change and global environmental harm. So that's my little few comments there on environmental rights and other rights. Let me say something about environment and conflict, obviously, because that seems to be a bit on people's minds. Let me begin by quoting Mark Halsey, who in a 2004 piece points out that the existence of humans or various types of subjectivities will automatically equate to some degree of socio-environmental conflict. That said, I think we can think of a number of different types of environmental conflict. So there's the environment and natural resources as a source of conflict. So when groups fight over access to or use of natural resources. This is particularly salient, I think, in sort of depictions of peak oil or post-peak oil societies, where we've just simply run out of gasoline, so we're fighting over these last few resources. The environment and natural resources can fuel or fund existing conflicts, and I think this touches on Steve Wright's question during the discussion after Nigel's talk, where this exploitation is somehow helping an existing conflict or something that's already transpired. We can think of warring groups extracting diamonds or metals or timber that are then sold for finance conflicts. And then, maybe this is actually closer to Steve's point, the environment and natural resources could be a casualty of conflict, such as with the Vietnam War, when deforestation chemicals, such as Agent Orange, caused crop destruction. Or the first Gulf War, when oil wells were set ablaze. So there you see some other type of phenomenon going on, and war brings about this destruction. Nigel had mentioned that various international treaties talk about how we're not supposed to degrade the environment, or we're supposed to consider the environment during war. I would say that actually goes back to my childhood, when I actually had to read the Bible. And parts of the Pentateuch, Genesis and Deuteronomy, talk about how when you leave an enemy's lands, be sure not to put salt into their crops. So there's a sort of long history of the environment as sort of a casualty of conflict, both as something that has happened and as something that has been proscribed. I think when thinking about environmental conflict, it's natural to think about environmental degradation. And while the linkages between conflict and the environment are varied, they're not all negative. I think that's an important component for us to think about. Or to put it another way, they don't always describe or represent current or anticipated violence. So Muffet and Rook, in a 2011 article, contend that well-managed resources can help fund reconstruction efforts and help bring order from chaos. So if you have a country that has had years of civil war, and they have significant natural resources, it's possible that well-managed efforts to deal with these natural resources could be constructive for reconstruction purposes rather than necessarily a source of further conflict. Similarly, Rusted, in a 2011 article, argues that high-value natural resources have the potential to promote and consolidate peace. Valuable resources can help to jumpstart development, secure sustainable growth, raise living standards, and increase economic equality. They're also an important source of foreign currency for cash-strapped governments. And so can reduce dependence on international aid, and can support compensation and post-conflict relief for more affected populations. So while that may raise questions about when we think about intergenerationality, I do think that it's important to think about the environment and conflict not as the negative relationship, but in a positive one as well. I think it's here in the analysis of environment and conflict that we might expose both some of the greatest injustices in the world and reveal which groups have been, currently are, or likely to become environmental victims, but also discover potential for justice, as both Muffet and Rook and Roosted intended. Let me conclude by posing a question that Nigel posed early on in his talk, the why of criminology. And so I guess we could sort of think of this as sort of some of the flower food for the four-leaf clover analogy. Going back to Mark Halsey's 2004 article, he writes, like previous decades, the first few years of the 21st century have heralded the notion that global depletions of biodiversity, as well as human-induced declinations in air, water, and soil quality, are chronic processes rather than fleeting events. These are not, he writes, it now seems clear, the result of some inexplicable blip in supposedly predictable weather patterns, breeding cycles, market forces, or the like. Instead, they are fundamentally linked to the normal operation of various political, cultural, and economic practices. Halsey continues that a key critical criminological task is to bring to light the factors which function to divide criminal from so-called normal, routine, or accepted practice. Rob White, in a 2010 piece, takes this a step further. He writes, one task of eco-global criminology, his more recent permutation of new criminology, is to name these harms as criminal, even if not considered illegal in conventional terms. Those who determine and shape the law are very often those whose activities need to be criminalized for the sake of planetary well-being. Thus, as we continue to study the harms against humanity, against the environment, against non-human animals committed by both powerful institutions and by ordinary people, I think we as green criminologists can play a role in how we respond to those harms through existing appendages and new features within the criminal justice system, something that Nigel talked a little bit about. In so doing, however, we have to be sensitive to the fact that criminalizing a behavior is a very poor way of reducing its occurrence, something that criminologists have consistently revealed, a point that Mark Halsey himself makes. But criminalizing heretofore legal but evil activities, or legal but environmentally harmful activities, is not our only goal or our only tool, so to speak. We can play a vital role in how we label or frame harm, and how harm is socially and historically constructed. Both White in his piece for your book, Tanya, The Conceptual Contours of Green Criminology, has referred to as constructivist green criminology. In a 2010 piece, Snyder reminds us that social movements that generate a continual swell of protest can play an essential role in creating a culture in which certain business activities, methods, and practices become culturally unacceptable, publicly shamed, and shunned by all self-declared responsible organizations and actors. Oppositional social movements can successfully publicize the dangers of whatever the danger may be, fill in the blank, make it visible, introduce it as a marker of corporate social irresponsibility. Just as important, and perhaps even more so, we as green criminologists can help understand the etiology of environmental crime and harm, and help us understand the meaning of environmental harm and crime. As Mike Holm, the climate scientist, social scientist, suggests, science may be solving the mysteries of climate, but it's not helping us discover the meaning of climate change. And so I would suggest that if we do not understand which groups of people commit which harms and why, and what these harms mean, it would be perilous for the species to have much impact on them. This, to return to the four-leaf clover, will take faith, hope, love, and luck in small things, but I think it's well worth it. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions, please.
Have you given much thought to methodology of penalties and punishment?
Say more.
Well, yeah, you've outlined very well all the various possible crimes, gas guzzling cars, to the but what about the penalties? Is it just a theory, or there should be some punishment?
Maybe what we need then is a sort of fifth lead. I haven't given much or sufficient thought to ways to penalize things. I think because that requires a consideration of who's doing the harm, as well as what that impact is. How we treat EP, very different than how we treat individual litters, even if the etiology of that may be quite similar. I was struck by the fact that about a year ago, I found that the Environmental Protection Agency has an environmental crimes most wanted list. And so I was hoping that the CEOs of major organizations would all be listed there. But in fact, these were sort of poor working class people who had dumped their oil down the storm drain. Should those people be punished? I think they should be educated. So I think that to some extent we have to be thinking about sort of scope of harm and questions of ideology as we construct penalties, but I don't think that one has to happen before the other. So that probably should be included in my calculus. The thing that I would add, though, and this probably makes me a bad anthropologist, is that I think there are very interesting lessons we can learn cross-nationally For example, the Zapotec peoples, who Laura Nader has studied, consider the spoiling of the commons to be equivalent to homicide, and so they were treated comparably. I'm by no means a proponent of the death penalty, but I find that to be a rather compelling idea that gets elevated in that regard. So I would hope that we would be creative in our thinking, especially given that some crimes are going to be peculiar to certain localities. So I've danced around your question, but I welcome some suggestion. Continue that.
Types of punishment?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Rendition.
Yeah. But I'll note that for further foliage.
Yes,
Sort of point. On the punishment issue, I did a webinar a couple of days ago with some people who were all litter activists. And almost to a man and the one woman, they were very punitive and very keen on using all of the many resources available to the state to come down hard on individual or working class smoking litterers. And I was trying to push back against that, and sometimes I was thinking, am I pushing back against this because of my penological knowledge about the effectiveness of punishment, or was I pushing back because of my friendly, organic, green? And I found them sort of fusing, but I wasn't making any progress with them.
I do think that shaming has an important role in this regard. I think we have to be sensitive to issues of class. But I remember when the Hummer was a very popular vehicle in the States, and I felt it my moral obligation every time I drove by one to stick up my middle finger. It was sort of like I was signaling or flashing my lights, but I would just stick up my middle finger because I thought that they were essentially saying, fuck you to the environment. So I thought, well, I'm going to say that back to them. That created some tense moments because their cars were usually larger than mine. But often by the time that sort of registered what it was that I was doing, I was long gone. And I don't drive that fast. But I do think that we could bring in elements of shaming if we are sensitive to issues of class. And maybe that's a way of sort of triangulating points.
But you see, it seems to me that where we are dealing with corporate crime, we have a tendency to be punitive. And I try to be consistent.
Right.
If I'm not going to be punitive on these poor working class smokers, I'm afraid I'm going to have to find ways of not being punitive with these smoke stack industries.
And why would you want to be
leaving their
consistent?
guts all over the place.
Well, why don't you want to be consistent?
I want to be consistent.
Why?
Because just turning things around is not enough. But,
I guess
I can see the attraction and the great delight to be had to bring the forces of evil down, but they have to be treated.
I guess the way I think of it is that a lot of individuals will be under various restraints, as Agnew argues, whereas for large corporations, they may think are under restraint, are probably engaging in techniques of neutralization.
Where I found myself in agreement with one of the participants, I don't think you'll mind me mentioning it, is a campaigner who uses the law to impact on the authorities that are responsible for litter. And I said, I'm perfectly happy for you to do that because these are biddable corporations who have, calculations, and if you make enough externality for them, you will get them to do that. But he was equally keen on, privatised police forces roaming around, pouncing on every single cigarette butt that fell to earth. And I was trying to make a distinction.
Right.
That I was happier to use the force of the law preventatively on companies, but I'm still not entirely happy with that. I think that the green is more organic, mulching these things down rather than isolating them.
Steve.
Something completely different but related. This stuff's the sort of amateur league. I'm more interested in the Manchester United offenders. I shouldn't be saying that. I'm in Newcastle, the home of the longest stadium. Sign of the times. I'm just wondering a bit. I mean, I believe all conflict's a bad thing, and sometimes you have to up the ante. So the question I've got is the conversation we were having earlier. Does the environmental movement need to use new technologies to gather data to up the ante? You mentioned to me about the use of unmanned aerial vehicles for surveillance from the environmental side. What role do you see for using new technologies, social networks, in terms of mobilization and calling to account?
Well, this is, I think, a good example of how I'm maybe not as wed to consistency as Nick is. I have tremendous problems with the use of drones for civil surveillance in the United States. It violates Fourth Amendment protections on unreasonable searches. But I have no problem using it to see whether or not companies are shirking their environmental responsibilities. If that's inconsistent, then so what? I think that there's an environment to protect. So I do think that we could creatively use drones, and in fact, some of the local laws that have started to be written, because individuals can buy drones, don't necessarily consider that as a possible use. So as long as you can see the drone, you're allowed to use it, and so that could enable individuals to go out to various properties or near various properties and use them even if governmental entities can't. As a social media tool, so we talked about sort of eyewitness and things like that, I'd be very excited at that possibility. I think we often think of technology as either sort of an evil force representative of market forces that have contributed to new environmental problems like e-waste, or we think of it as a sort of band-aid solution or sort of hope for technological salvation. We really need to sort of change our ethos. But I think that you're very right that it could be part of a mobilization effort as well as a sort of resistance effort, if I'm speaking what you're suggesting.
This might sound slightly convoluted and a bit undergraduate, but something that you said, I really enjoyed the speech, something that you said towards the end there really sort of stuck in my mind, what you said about having faith. I mean, do you not perhaps think that some of the disparities in religious values have actually perpetuated some of the things that are causing the issues that we're having in modern society? I'm sort of referring back to, this is where the undergraduate bit, the idea of sort of personification of the ecology, having this great big Titan god Gaia. Do you not think that the sort of devaluing pagan values and the sort of Christian values that have been around since you mentioned sort of the start of the Bibles, do you not think that by doing that they've given divinity to man, and by doing that, that sort of provided us with all that we need to devalue the ecology?
Maybe. I think that there have been some interesting efforts to try to link religious philosophy to linking with this notion of, well, this is God's earth that we've been given, therefore we should protect it. But that comes into conflict with interpretations that say, well, God gave us this for our use. And so you get into this sort of verse quoting kind of struggle. But I do think that there is a way to, since most religion entails sort of picking the things that you, or the practice of religion entails picking the things that you like and excluding the things that you don't like from doctrine. I think that tapping into aspects of religious thinking and practice that promote ecological well-being is probably States, even though there's always talk about how we're a country founded on liberty and freedom, which is sometimes claimed to be a euphemism for Christian values, what we really value in the United States is consumption. That is our religion, that is our practice. And so most people, irrespective of where they side on the religious spectrum, will ultimately come down and say, I want it, I want to buy it, and that's my God-given right to do so. So that becomes a challenge when market practices get used or are justified by faith-based ones. We're arguing against sort of two titans out there. I think there is a role for religious thinking, and maybe something that we should be bringing in. And I think that some of the Braithwaite's work, notions of restorative justice, notions of shaming, may have a role in that regard. All I had said, what I was thinking about when I said faith, had less to do with religion and more to do with commitment, both on our part and in the way that we promote what it is that we're doing. Because if we don't have some element of faith that this is important and bring about some sort of change in what we want, then we're not being consistent and we're not being truthful to what it is that we're trying to do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I mean, leading on to that, referring back to what Dr. Zhao said about, referring back actually, given that that's important, thinking of sort of a pre-Christian perspective, do you think that for the development in frameworks about the legal value and intrinsic value of wildlife and fauna and flora, do you think that it's essential to perhaps personificate some of the environment?
I don't know. I think that there may be some utility to that. And maybe this is something that, this is maybe a way to think of what something like the land for, or the Trust for Public Land does in the United States, where it sort of says, well, we're going to accept the fact that the environment is not going to be valued for its own intrinsic worth. So we'll treat it as a commodity, we'll buy it, and we'll set it aside to be undeveloped. So maybe there's a possibility there. But I like the creativity with which you're bringing to this dimension of eco-philosophy. So let's continue that.
Yeah, Matthew.
Just because it seems quite relevant to what you said, a student of mine from Kenya, Criminology logic, was talking to me a couple of weeks ago about the role of the church in the development of the use of genetically modified crops in Africa in general, because it seems that apparently, I've read various examples before, that apparently the firms petitioned the Vatican to essentially okay genetically modified crops in order for the largely Catholic parts of Africa to accept them, and so on. And of course, I know genetically modified crops we know have potentially disastrous effects on biodiversity, traditional products, and so on. Curious example, I think, perhaps of the misuse of philosophy in the religious sort of background as well as crows, I suppose.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I hadn't heard that before.
Sort of the idea of getting your throwing holy water on your machine then before going.
Faithful.
Yes.
The blessed feeling.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Avi, for traveling all this way for 3 days. Excellent. And yeah, thank you all for traveling so far. And I just wanted to give a particular thanks to all the students that joined us today. The next generation of green criminologists coming up to further this field. It's really wonderful that you've taken an interest and you've taken a day out of your weekend to come and sit here and listen. So that's great. Thanks for coming. And I have all of your emails. So you're on the list that will be told about all the next events. And hopefully you can join us again in February in Cardiff, where Jenny will be hosting us to look at timber and wildlife trafficking. Right now, plans are that they're just the pub just up this road here called Five Swans. Everyone's welcome to join us for a drink. I know some people are heading out to catch their trains, but we'll be there until about 7 if you'd all like to come and join us. But thanks again for coming. It's been a nice day.
Thank you.